Pregnant widow trapped by cruel mother-in-law, until her soldier husband shocks everyone by returning alive. Rain pounded the windows the day Clara received the telegram. Her hands shook as she read the carefully typed words. Her husband, James Whitmore, was missing in action, presumed dead. She didn't cry, not immediately. She just stood there, staring at the black letters, numb from the inside out. Her belly, nearly 7 months swollen with their first child, seemed to tighten beneath her dress. The world didn't collapse all at once. It crumbled quietly, like ash drifting from a dying fire. James had promised to come home. He had written to her every week from the front lines, always with a little joke at the end, always with love. The last letter said he would be in a safer area now. Clara believed him. She had to. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, didn't shed a tear either when the news arrived. She read the telegram once, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the Bible on her mantel. Then she turned to Clara with eyes as sharp as thorns and said, almost casually, that it was time for things to change. Clara was no longer a wife, she said. She was now a widow and a burden. Clara, still dazed, tried to understand what Margaret meant. She had lived in the Whitmore house since marrying James, working hard, cleaning, cooking, never complaining even when Margaret made life difficult with her coldness and controlling rules. Clara had nowhere else to go, and Margaret knew it. The next morning, Margaret told Clara she was moving into the small root cellar beneath the kitchen just for a while, because the upstairs bedrooms were too much to keep warm and firewood was low. Clara obeyed, confused but too exhausted to argue. She thought it might just be for a night. But when the heavy cellar door closed behind her and the latch clicked from above, Clara knew. She was not being moved. She was being locked away. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time blurred in the damp dark. Clara slept on sacks of old flour and potatoes, wrapping herself in thin blankets that didn't keep the cold out. Margaret brought her food sometimes, but not regularly. A bowl of oats, a slice of dry bread, sometimes nothing. Water came in tin cups, tasting like rust and rain. The only light came from a small vent near the ceiling, where a sliver of outside flickered when the sun was kind. Clara tried not to panic. She rubbed her stomach slowly, whispering to the baby to stay strong, to hold on. She made up stories about the stars they couldn't see and the father who would have loved them more than words. Her lips cracked, her back ached, and sometimes her hands trembled from hunger. But she stayed quiet. She knew Margaret didn't want the town asking questions. No one came to visit. Margaret had told the neighbors Clara had left to stay with her aunt out west, that she needed time to grieve, to rest, that she wasn't strong enough to remain. Margaret spoke with calm and grace in church. She brought pies to the pastor's wife. She smiled more often than she used to. People believed her. They always had. After all, Margaret had lived in that town all her life. She had buried a husband, raised a son, and kept a perfect garden. What reason would she have to lie? Clara heard footsteps above her. Margaret's boots pacing. Then silence. Then creaks again. Sometimes Clara thought she imagined the voices, the sounds. Once, she thought she heard a child humming. It was so faint, she almost cried from the sound of it. A reminder that the world still existed up there, beyond the dirt and the dark. Her baby moved often now, a flutter at first, then stronger kicks. It hurt sometimes, but she welcomed the pain. It was life. It was hope. It reminded her to keep going. She scratched marks into the wall to count the days, though she wasn't sure anymore if her calendar matched the truth. She whispered James's name to herself at night like a prayer. She remembered his hands, warm and steady, the way he tucked her hair behind her ear, the way he used to hum when nervous. Her memories were the only things Margaret couldn't lock away. One afternoon, Clara heard something different, a soft rustling, then a whisper, so quiet she thought it was the wind. She held her breath. Then it came again, a girl's voice, timid but curious, asking if someone was down there. Clara pressed her ear against the vent and whispered back, "Yes, yes, she was here." The girl didn't speak again that day, but she came back the next. Her name was Anna, no older than 10, from the farm down the road. She brought little things, a half biscuit wrapped in cloth, a spoonful of jam. Clara cried quietly after she left, not from sadness but from being seen. For the first time since the cellar door closed, someone knew she was alive. Anna returned again and again. Sometimes she just talked, telling Clara about school, about her dog, about the chickens who wouldn't lay eggs. Clara didn't tell her the full truth, only enough. Enough to make Anna understand that the woman upstairs wasn't who everyone thought she was. Enough to make Anna keep coming back. The bond between them grew like a vine in the dark, delicate but determined. Still, Clara knew time was running out. Her body was slowing. She felt heavy, weaker. She was afraid of giving birth in that cellar, alone. She didn't know how. There was no water, no help. Margaret wasn't going to call a doctor. Clara begged Anna one night through the vent, begged her to find someone. Someone who might believe. Anna hesitated. She was just a child. But Clara's voice trembled in that desperate way that children understand without needing full words. Anna nodded and ran. Clara waited the next day and the next. No Anna. No bread. No whispers. Her fear grew sharper than hunger. She thought maybe Margaret had caught her. Maybe Anna was punished. Maybe no one was coming. She pressed her hands over her belly and whispered to the baby not to come yet. Not yet. Please wait. Miles away, across the low hills and pale roads, a man with a limp and sunburnt skin walked slowly toward the town sign. His coat was torn, his beard unshaved. His eyes, wild with hope and disbelief, fixed on the familiar shape of his hometown. He had survived, barely. James Whitmore had crawled from the battlefield with a bullet through his shoulder and a prayer in his heart. He had been mistaken for dead, reported as lost. But he had lived. And for months, he had struggled to return. No letters, no telegrams. Just one purpose, to get back to Clara. He didn't know yet what waited for him. He didn't know that the house he called home now had secrets beneath its floor. He didn't know that the woman he loved was buried in silence just steps from the kitchen. But he would know soon. And when he did, the quiet little town with its clean lawns and kind smiles would never forget what followed. James walked down the dusty path toward the Whitmore house, unaware of how tightly fate had coiled itself around the old structure. The town looked mostly unchanged, familiar homes, the church spire, the old store with faded paint. Yet there was a strange stillness in the air, like everything was holding its breath. When he passed the general store, the clerk blinked in shock. The man muttered something and stumbled inside. James kept walking, each step heavier as the house came into view. The place looked smaller than he remembered. The porch sagged more, the shutters were crooked. No smoke came from the chimney. No light in the windows. As he climbed the porch steps, his heart raced, not from excitement, but dread. The door opened before he knocked. Margaret stood in the doorway, a shadow in her long black dress, her expression frozen. For a moment, neither moved. Then her voice, cold and flat, broke the silence. She said he shouldn't be here, that he was supposed to be dead. He asked about Clara, his voice trembling with something too deep to name. Margaret didn't blink. She told him Clara had left months ago, gone east to have her baby with a cousin. She said the grief was too much, that she couldn't stay. James stared at her, seeing the lie stretch across her face like thin fabric overwrought. He didn't argue. Not yet. He just nodded slowly and stepped past her into the house. Inside, the silence was sharp, unnatural. He scanned the room, spotting little things, the scarf Clara had embroidered, stuffed behind the stove. A hairbrush near the hearth. His boots, still by the door. His heart twisted. He knew Clara hadn't left. Something was wrong. He didn't say a word as he walked to the kitchen. Then he heard it, barely a sound. A cough, low and hoarse, muffled by what in distance. He turned toward the cellar door. Margaret shouted from behind, her voice shrill now, but James didn't stop. He threw open the latch and yanked the door wide. The stench of damp earth hit him first, then the cold. Then, at the bottom, a figure. A woman, curled in shadow, too thin, her hands wrapped around her belly. His heart stopped. It was Clara. She didn't recognize him at first. She blinked, dazed, then sat up with effort. He ran to her, tears pouring down his face before he even reached her. He lifted her carefully, whispering her name over and over, as if saying it might reverse the damage. Her eyes widened with slow realization. She touched his face, convinced she was dreaming. But he was real. He was here. Margaret didn't come down the stairs. She stood at the top, shaking, muttering that it had all been necessary. That Clara was weak. That the child would have been a disgrace without control. James didn't listen. He carried Clara out into the daylight, shielding her eyes as she blinked against the brightness for the first time in weeks. She clutched him as if she might fall apart without him. But she didn't. Not yet. Anna appeared from behind the neighbor's barn, running full speed when she saw Clara in James's arms. She had told her older brother, Who had told the sheriff? And now the town's slow hush was beginning to crack. People came out of their houses, staring. Whispers started. The man they thought was dead was alive. The woman they thought had run away had never left. James shouted for a doctor. The sheriff arrived minutes later, his eyes wide, trying to take in everything at once. Clara was laid in the neighbor's home, wrapped in warm quilts. Her labor started that night. James sat by her, holding her hand, whispering stories from the war and all the ways he had tried to come back to her. The baby came just before dawn, a little girl, tiny and crying with surprising strength. Clara wept when she held her, not from pain but from overwhelming relief. They named her Hope. But the story didn't end with birth. Margaret was taken into custody, though she didn't struggle. She sat in silence as the sheriff asked her why. Why lock away her daughter-in-law? Why lie to everyone? Margaret only said one thing: that shame ruins families. That it was better to keep things hidden than let them rot in public. Her words were cold, her eyes empty. She showed no remorse. Yet something shifted in the town. People who had always believed Margaret's perfect image began to see the cracks. The florist remembered how Margaret once scolded Clara for crying at church. The pastor's wife recalled the bruises Clara had hidden under long sleeves. People who had looked the other way for years now realized they had been blind. The house wasn't quiet because it was peaceful. It had been silent because it was suffocating. The sheriff brought James and Clara to town for testimony. Clara spoke softly but clearly, recounting the days in the cellar, the hunger, the fear, the desperation. James described his return, what he found, the lies he'd been told. Anna was brought in too, her little hands folded nervously, but she spoke with truth and bravery. The courtroom was full. No one could look away. The story gripped the entire town like a storm. The judge, moved more than he expected, sentenced Margaret to time in a state facility for psychological review and confinement. Some thought it was too soft. Others thought it was merciful. Clara didn't ask for revenge. She asked only that her daughter never live in fear again. James and Clara didn't return to the Whitmore house. They moved into a small cottage near the edge of town. It was nothing grand, but it had light and laughter and fresh air. Clara planted a garden. James built shelves. Hope grew fast, her laugh as strong as her lungs. And Anna visited often, sitting on the porch and helping rock the baby to sleep. But just when peace began to settle, a letter arrived. A legal one, stamped and sealed. Margaret had requested to see Clara. One visit. One conversation. James hesitated. He wanted to burn it. But Clara, surprisingly, agreed. She visited the state home alone, days later. Margaret looked smaller now, older, weaker. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked if the baby had survived. Clara nodded. Margaret looked down at her hands. Then she whispered that she didn't hate Clara, that she hated what weakness did to women, that she had tried to crush it before it crushed her. Clara stood still, unmoved. Then she said one sentence: that love is not weakness, and neither is survival. She left without looking back. But outside, she breathed deeply. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just walked into the sunlight, stronger than the girl who had once whispered to the darkness, wondering if she'd ever be found. Spring came slowly that year, as if the land itself needed time to believe the darkness was truly gone. Clara stood barefoot in the garden behind the cottage, baby Hope bundled in her arms, eyes wide at the world. James sat nearby carving a rattle from old cedar, his hands steady now in a way they hadn't been for months. There was peace, yes, but peace always brings the ghosts closer. The kind that don't rattle chains, but whisper doubts in quiet moments. Clara still woke some nights reaching for light that wasn't there. James still flinched at certain sounds, sudden footsteps or slammed doors. But they spoke now, openly, freely. Words healed things silence once buried. The town had changed too. People walked slower past their gate. Some waved, others apologized, clumsily, awkwardly, but sincerely. The sheriff came by once a week just to check in. Anna visited nearly every day, sometimes with wildflowers, sometimes with questions only a child could ask, like if baby Hope remembered the dark. Clara always smiled and said no, because she would never let her child carry what she had been forced to endure. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. It was thin, folded tight, with no return address. Inside, a short note written in sharp, slanted handwriting. It wasn't from Margaret. It was from a man named Ezra Thorne, a lawyer from 3 towns over. He claimed to represent the estate of a client named Edith Haverford, someone Clara had never met. The letter said Clara had been named in Edith's final will, and she should come at once to discuss an inheritance. James was suspicious. Clara was confused. They nearly ignored it. But curiosity won. 2 days later, they rode out to meet the lawyer. His office was small, lined with dusty books, and Ezra was a stiff man with stiff manners. He explained that Edith had been Margaret's sister, estranged for decades. Apparently, Edith had followed Clara's story in the newspaper, and before her death, she made changes to her will. Edith had owned land, not just a small farm, but several hundred acres that touched the edge of town, rich, fertile, unclaimed. She had no heirs. She had left it all to Clara. Ezra handed her the deed and a key. Clara stared at them, stunned. Land meant future. Land meant control. Margaret had locked her in a cellar to protect the family name, and now that same name had handed her something stronger, freedom. But the land came with its own history. When they visited it that week, Clara and James found an abandoned house on the edge of a field. The roof was bowed, the porch half collapsed, but the walls stood firm. It had once been grand, but time had peeled its paint and dulled its spirit. Clara walked through it slowly, floorboards creaking beneath her. James followed, baby Hope sleeping in his arms. The room smelled of dust and time, but not rot. There was something honest in the decay. That night, they agreed to fix it, to build something new on bones of something old. It wouldn't be easy. They didn't have much money, just time and will. But that had always been enough for them. While renovations began, another twist arrived. One morning, Anna came running, breathless, clutching a newspaper from town. A story on the front page mentioned a nurse at the state facility where Margaret was staying. She had been dismissed after it was discovered she had passed letters for patients without proper clearance. Letters addressed to someone in Clara's town. Someone using a fake name. James took the paper, eyes scanning fast. He recognized the address, one of the old mailboxes near the edge of town, rented anonymously. For a moment, they didn't know what to do. Margaret was reaching out again. But why? Clara had already seen her once. What else was left? The sheriff got involved. He located the box, opened it with a warrant. Inside were over a dozen letters, all from Margaret, but none addressed to Clara. Every letter was addressed to Hope. Margaret had been writing to her granddaughter. The letters were strange, not affectionate, not exactly. They were instructional, stern, almost like a diary full of rules. Advice on how to behave, how to be strong, how to never trust softness. But between the lines, there was something sad, a tone that wavered, as if the writer didn't fully believe her own warnings. Clara read them all. Then she burned them. But something about the letters unsettled her. She feared Margaret would try to return, despite the court's orders. Despite her age. Fear, once planted, doesn't disappear. It sleeps. Clara didn't sleep well for days. She double-locked the doors. James stayed up longer, watching shadows. They waited for something. But nothing came. Instead, they received one final visitor. Ezra the lawyer returned, unannounced. He carried a small box wrapped in linen. Inside was a silver locket, old, tarnished, etched with the initials JW. It had belonged to James's father. Margaret had left it behind when she was moved to a different facility. According to Ezra, her final instructions were that Clara should have it. No explanation. Clara stared at it for a long time. Then she opened it. Inside, 2 small pictures. One of James as a baby. One of Margaret when she was young, smiling a real smile, not the one Clara had known. The kind that looked like hope. Clara didn't cry. But she didn't close the locket either. She placed it on a shelf beside the window of the new house, where the light hit it every morning. Not as a memory, but as a warning. Months passed. The house came alive again. Neighbors helped rebuild the barn. Anna painted wildflowers on the shutters. Hope learned to walk in the grass and speak her first words in sunlight, not shadow. She laughed easily and often. One summer evening, James and Clara sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Hope toddled around chasing a butterfly. A breeze moved through the tall grass. Clara turned to James and told him she sometimes dreamed of the cellar, not as a nightmare, but as something distant, like a story that once belonged to her, but no longer defined her. James reached for her hand, and she held it tight. She said the house they built wouldn't be known for pain, that Hope would grow up hearing the truth, but never wearing its weight, that she would know what had been survived, but more importantly, what had been chosen after. And then, just before the sun disappeared behind the hills, Clara whispered that sometimes the darkness isn't what destroys you. Sometimes it's what proves you can still find the light. Hope laughed, chasing the butterfly through the lavender bushes. And James, for the first time in a long time, laughed too. The cellar was gone. The lies were gone. The name that had once meant control now meant survival. And somewhere far away, in a place where echoes go to sleep, Margaret Whitmore closed her eyes for the last time. Not hated, but never forgiven. And Clara, the girl who once counted time in heartbeats under the floor, now counted it in kisses, footsteps, and laughter. She had been buried and found, forgotten and remembered, broken and rebuilt. And as night fell, the stars blinked awake one by one, not watching from a distance anymore, but witnessing. The story was no longer trapped. It had finally stepped into the light.